Jack Sullivan stood in the charred remains of what had once been his garage workshop, the acrid smell of smoke still hanging in the air. 3 days home from deployment, and this was what he had to deal with. But it wasn't the tools or the fishing gear or even his father's old workbench that made his hands shake with rage. It was the black and barely recognizable remnants of his son Mike's marine dress blues, the uniform his boy had worn with such pride at his graduation from boot camp just 6 months ago. They had no right, Margaret Sullivan whispered beside him, her voice breaking. At 62, Jack's wife had weathered many storms in their 35 years of marriage, but he'd never seen her this angry. They had absolutely no right. The letter from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association had been taped to their front door when they returned from visiting their daughter in Arizona. In sterile, bureaucratic language, it explained that the HOA had remediated violations of community standards by removing unsightly items from the Sullivan property during their absence. The garage storage, according to HOA President Diane Keller, had become an eyesore that diminished property values. Jack picked up a scrap of blue fabric, the gold trim still faintly visible on one edge. His son Mike was currently stationed overseas, serving his first tour of duty. The dress blues had been left in the garage temporarily in a garment bag waiting to be properly stored after Mike's last visit home. Mrs. Keller said they sent 3 notices. Margaret said, wiping tears from her face. But we were at Jenny's for the past 2 weeks. We didn't get any notices. Jack's phone rang. It was their neighbor, Bill Harper. Jack, I just heard what happened. I'm sick about it. I saw them going through your stuff last week, but Diane told me it was approved, said you'd given permission before you left town. Bill's voice was tight with anger. If I'd known what they were really doing. Jack thanked him and hung up, his mind racing. The Sullivans had lived in Whispering Pines for just 8 months, having downsized after Jack's retirement from 40 years at the steel mill. The HOA had been a minor annoyance at first, citations for having their trash cans out too long or flower choices that weren't on the approved vegetation list. But this was something else entirely. I need to call Mike, Margaret said quietly. No, Jack replied, shaking his head. The boy's got enough to worry about over there. We'll handle this ourselves first. He pulled out his phone again and scrolled through its contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Colonel James Reeves had been Jack's best friend since high school. They'd enlisted together back in '82, though their paths had diverged when James made a career of military service while Jack returned to civilian life. James, Jack said when the colonel answered, his voice surprisingly steady, even the storm brewing inside him. I need your help. They burned Mike's uniform. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Who did? The colonel's voice had dropped to a dangerous octave. The HOA, Homeowners Association. They went into our garage while we were away visiting Jenny and destroyed a bunch of our belongings, including Mike's dress blues. Text me your address, Colonel Reeves replied without hesitation. I'll be there tomorrow morning. Jack ended the call and stood silent for a moment, looking at the destruction around him. In all his 64 years, he'd never been one to seek confrontation. But as he carefully folded the scrap of blue fabric and placed it in his pocket, he knew this wasn't just about property rights or homeowner bylaws. This was about respect. This was about honor. And the Whispering Pines HOA was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. The black SUV pulled into the Sullivans' driveway at precisely 800 hours. Colonel James Reeves stepped out, his posture immaculate despite being in his 60s. He wasn't in uniform, he wore a simple polo shirt and khakis, but there was no mistaking the military bearing that defined every movement. The silver at his temples only added to his commanding presence. Jack, he said, embracing his old friend firmly before turning to Margaret. Mrs. Sullivan, I wish we were meeting again under better circumstances. Margaret hugged him tightly. Thank you for coming, James. Come inside, I've made coffee. As they entered the modest home, Jack noticed his friend's gaze sweep systematically across the neighborhood. The colonel was assessing terrain as he'd been trained to do. Nice community, Reeves remarked, accepting a mug from Margaret. Manicured lawns, uniform mailboxes. Very controlled. Jack nodded grimly. That's Diane Keller's vision. She runs the HOA like it's her personal fiefdom. The colonel's eyes hardened. Show me what happened. In the garage, Reeves surveyed the damage with the careful scrutiny of a man who had investigated incidents in war zones. He said nothing as Jack pointed out where Mike's uniform had been stored, but his jaw tightened visibly. And you have the letter? He asked finally. Jack handed him the HOA notice. Reeves read it twice, his expression unchanging. This mentions nothing about destroying property, he observed. It only states they were authorized to remove violations from the premises. We've already called a lawyer, Margaret said. He says we have a case for unlawful destruction of property, but it could take months to resolve. The colonel nodded. The legal route is important, but sometimes a more immediate response is also required. He pulled out his phone. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of inviting a few friends." By noon, 7 cars had parked along the Sullivan Street. The men and women who emerged shared the same unmistakable bearing as Colonel Reeves. Some were older, some surprisingly young. All moved with purpose. "Jack," Margaret Reeves said, "let me introduce some colleagues. This is Master Sergeant Ortiz, Captain Williams, Major Chen, Staff Sergeant Bell, Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, and Sergeant Major Lewis." Jack shook each hand, noting the firm grips and direct gazes. "And this," Reeves continued, "is General Patricia Harmon." A tall woman with silver hair stepped forward. Her handshake was brief but warm. "Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, your son serves under my command. The 2nd Battalion is an exceptional unit, and from what I hear, Lance Corporal Sullivan is an exceptional Marine." Margaret's eyes widened. "You know, Mike, I make it my business to know all my Marines," General Harmon replied. "When James called me about this situation, I happened to be stateside for a conference. This seemed more important than another PowerPoint presentation." The doorbell rang. Margaret opened it to find Diane Keller standing on the porch, a clipboard in hand and an irritated expression on her face. "Mrs. Sullivan," she began without preamble, "we've received complaints about unauthorized vehicles parked on your street. The HOA bylaws clearly state that guests must use visitor parking or—" She stopped abruptly, noticing the gathering inside. Her eyes darted uncertainly between the faces watching her. Colonel Reeves stepped forward. "Miss Keller, I'm James Reeves, United States Marine Corps. We were just discussing an incident involving the destruction of military property." "Military property?" Diane's confident demeanor faltered slightly. "A dress uniform belonging to Lance Corporal Michael Sullivan," General Harmon added, moving beside the colonel. "Perhaps you care to join us? We have some questions about your HOA procedures." Diane Keller's face paled as she realized who she was speaking to. There must be some misunderstanding. The board simply enforced the bylaws. The garage was in violation off." "The garage," Jack interrupted, finding his voice, "contained my son's Marine Corps dress blues. The uniform he earned serving this country. And your people burned it." Diane's eyes widened. "No, that's impossible. They only removed some old junk and—" "Junk?" Staff Sergeant Bell echoed, his voice dangerously quiet. The silence that followed was deafening. Diane Keller, who had ruled Whispering Pines with imperious authority for 5 years, suddenly looked very small. "Perhaps," Colonel Reeves suggested with deceptive mildness, "we should take this discussion to your HOA office. I believe the entire board should hear what we have to say." "The board doesn't meet until next Tuesday," Diane replied automatically. General Harmon smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "I think they'll want to make an exception, don't you?" The Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse had never been so crowded. Residents filled every chair, stood along the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The monthly HOA meetings typically drew only a handful of homeowners, but tonight was different. Tonight, there was blood in the water. Diane Keller rapped her gavel sharply. "This emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association will come to order." Her voice was steady, but her eyes kept darting to the military officers seated in the front row. "Before we address the Sullivan matter," she continued, "I want to remind everyone that the HOA board has always acted in the best interest of property values and community standards." "My son's uniform is not a community standards issue," Jack Sullivan interrupted, rising to his feet. "It's a matter of respect." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Many residents were hearing about the incident for the first time. Colonel Reeves stood. "If I may address the board?" Without waiting for permission, he walked to the center of the room. "For those who don't know me, I'm Colonel James Reeves, United States Marine Corps. I'm here today because of an incident that occurred in this community last week." His voice carried effortlessly, the product of decades commanding troops. "While the Sullivan family was away, members of this HOA entered their property, removed items from their garage, and destroyed them, including the dress uniform of Lance Corporal Michael Sullivan, who is currently deployed overseas serving this country." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Board member Lisa Chen looked visibly disturbed, while Ted Wilson stared at his hands. Only Diane maintained her composure, though her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. "Miss Keller," Colonel Reeves continued, "perhaps you could explain to everyone the HOA policy that authorizes the destruction of a Marine's uniform." Diane cleared her throat. "Colonel, there was clearly a misunderstanding. The cleaning crew was instructed to remove visible violations, not to destroy personal property. If the uniform was properly stored—" "It was in a garment bag," Margaret interjected sharply, "clearly labeled with Mike's name and rank." "The real issue," Diane pressed on, "is that the Sullivan's garage door was frequently left open, exposing unsightly storage that violated our community aesthetic standards. After 3 written warnings, Warnings we never received because we were visiting our daughter, Jack cut in. An older man stood up from the middle row. I'm Bill Harper, the Sullivans' neighbor. Diane told me they had given permission for the HOA to clean up while they were away. That's the only reason I didn't stop it. More murmurs swept through the room. General Harmon rose next. I'm General Patricia Harmon. Lance Corporal Sullivan serves under my command. A Marine's dress blues are not merely clothing. They represent honor, commitment, and sacrifice. They are earned, not given. She turned to face the crowd rather than the board. How many veterans do we have in this room? Across the clubhouse, at least 20 people stood up, ranging from elderly Vietnam veterans to younger men and women who had served in more recent conflicts. And how many of you in the family members currently serving? Another dozen rose. The general nodded. I thought so. This isn't just about one family or one uniform. This is about how we treat those who serve this country and the symbols of their service. For the first time, Diane looked genuinely uncomfortable. General, I assure you, had we known. But you didn't bother to find out, did you? This came from Ted Wilson, surprising everyone. Diane, you told us the Sullivans had abandoned property in their garage. You never mentioned a military uniform. Diane's face flushed. Ted, that's not appropriate for. I think it's exactly appropriate, Lisa Chen interrupted. I move that we immediately discuss compensation for the Sullivans' loss and review our property enforcement procedures. I second that motion, Ted added quickly. Diane looked around desperately. We need to follow proper meeting protocol. I think, Colonel Reeves said quietly, that proper protocol went out the window when you burned a Marine's uniform. A man in the back stood up. My name is Robert Gaines. I've lived here for 10 years and served 20 in the Army. I move that we take an immediate vote of no confidence in President Keller's leadership. The room erupted in applause. Diane banged her gavel frantically. That is not on the agenda. This meeting is about the Sullivan incident only. Actually, Master Sergeant Ortiz spoke up. According to your own bylaws, which I took the liberty of reading this morning, Article 7, Section 3 states that any official business may be raised during emergency meetings if seconded by a board member. 3 days after the emergency HOA meeting, the Sullivans' doorbell rang. Jack opened the door to find Ted Wilson, the interim HOA president, standing on the porch with an envelope in hand. Jack, Ted said, extending the envelope. The board approved this unanimously last night. It's a check covering the full value of everything that was destroyed, plus an additional amount we hope will help make things right. Jack accepted the envelope but didn't open it. Thank you, Ted. It was never about the money, though. I know, Ted replied, meeting Jack's eyes directly. And I owe you an apology, too. I should have spoken up sooner about how Diane was running things. Many of us were uncomfortable, but we just went along. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Jack said, offering his hand. As they shook hands, Ted added, there's something else. Diane submitted her letter of apology for your son. I've reviewed it, and he hesitated. I think you should read it before deciding whether to send it. Inside the envelope alongside the check was a single sheet of paper. Jack unfolded it and read silently, his expression darkening with each line. This isn't an apology, he said finally. This is a justification. She's still claiming she was just following HOA procedures. Margaret read it over his shoulder and sighed. At least she signed it. Maybe it's the best we can expect from her. Your son deserves better, Ted said firmly. We all do. The new board is already revising the property enforcement protocols to prevent anything like this from happening again. And we're implementing a new requirement that at least 2 board members must approve any enforcement action. After Ted left, Jack called Colonel Reeves to update him. I'm not surprised, the colonel said. People like Diane rarely admit they're wrong. But that's not why I called. Can you and Margaret be home tomorrow around 1300 hours? There's something you need to see. The next day it dawned bright and clear. By noon, Jack noticed unusual activity in the neighborhood. Cars were slowly cruising past their house and neighbors were gathering on porches and lawns. At precisely 1:00 p.m., the sound of motorcycles broke the suburban quiet. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. The Patriot Guard Riders, a motorcycle group that attends military funerals and events, turned onto the Sullivan Street in perfect formation, American flags flying from the backs of their bikes. Behind them came a convoy of vehicles, police cruisers with lights flashing, fire trucks, and private cars with Marine Corps decals. The procession stopped in front of the Sullivan home, where Margaret stood with her hand over her mouth in astonishment. Colonel Reeves stepped out of the lead car, accompanied by General Harmon and a Marine Corps officer Jack didn't recognize. Jack, Margaret, the colonel said with a smile. This is Major David Hawkins, the supply officer for Mike's battalion. He has something for you. Major Hawkins stepped forward carrying a large box emblazoned with the Marine Corps emblem. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I'd like to present you with this. Inside the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a new set of marine dress blues, immaculate, precisely tailored, and complete with all the proper insignia. "But how did you know Mike's measurements?" Margaret asked, running her fingers reverently over the fabric. "Lance Corporal Sullivan's commanding officer made sure we had everything we needed," Major Hawkins replied with a smile. "There's more." From the box, he removed a folded flag in the traditional triangle case. "This flag was flown over the Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C., in honor of your son's service." By now, a crowd had gathered. Neighbors watched from their lawns, many with hands over hearts or offering salutes. Even children stood quietly, sensing the solemnity of the moment. "There's one more thing," General Harmon said, stepping forward. She held out a tablet. "Someone wants to talk to you." On the screen was Mike Sullivan's face, grainy but unmistakable, streaming from his base overseas. "Mom, Dad," he called, his voice crackling slightly over the connection. "Mike," Margaret cried, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, honey, can you see all this?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied with a grin. "General Harmon arranged everything. I can't believe what you guys did back there. The guys in my unit have been calling me HOA Slayer since they heard the story." Jack laughed through his own tears. "We didn't do much, son. It was Colonel Reeves and all these good people who made it happen." Mike grew serious. "Dad, is it true? About my blues?" Jack nodded. "I'm sorry, son. They're gone. But the course has provided you with new ones." 4 months later, the Sullivans' front yard bloomed with autumn flowers, red, white, and blue mums arranged in planters that Jack had built himself. A small Marine Corps flag flew alongside the American flag on their porch, both gently swaying in the October breeze. The site would have violated at least 3 HOA regulations under Diane Keller's reign, but those days were over. "Jack, we need to leave in 30 minutes if we're going to make it to the airport on time," Margaret called from inside the house. Today was the day they had been waiting for. Mike was coming home on leave. As Jack adjusted the flags one last time, Ted Wilson walked by with his dog. "Big day," Ted said with a smile. "The neighborhood's ready." Jack nodded. In the months since the incident, Whispering Pines had transformed. Under Ted's leadership, the HOA had shifted from enforcement to community building. Monthly cookouts in the park, a neighborhood watch program, and a veteran support group had all sprung from the ashes of that contentious meeting. "I still can't believe what you all did," Jack said, shaking Ted's hand. "It was the least we could do. See you this afternoon." Jack confirmed with a nod. The welcome home gathering for Mike was set for 4:00 p.m. in the community park. As the Sullivans drove to the airport, Margaret reached over and squeezed Jack's hand. "I was thinking about that woman this morning," she said quietly. "Jack did me to ask which woman. Diane Keller had put her house on the market 2 weeks after the incident and moved away shortly after. No one knew where she had gone. She made her choice," Jack replied. "I know, but I keep wondering if we could have done more." Jack considered this. "We offered her a chance to be part of something better. She wasn't ready." At the airport, they waited anxiously at the arrival's gate. When Mike finally appeared in his service uniform, Margaret burst into tears and Jack felt his own eyes growing moist. Their son looked older somehow, more poised, his shoulders straighter than Jack remembered. "Mom, Dad," Mike said, embracing them both at once. "It's so good to be home." On the drive back to Whispering Pines, Mike filled them in on his deployment, carefully avoiding operational details but sharing stories of the people he'd met and the places he'd seen. When they turned onto their street, he fell silent. "What's this?" he asked, staring out the window. Every house on the block displayed an American flag. Signs reading "Welcome Home, Lance Corporal Sullivan," and "Thank you for your service," dotted lawns and windows. Red, white, and blue ribbons adorned mailboxes and trees. "Just a little something the neighbors put together," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. As they pulled into the driveway, Mike noticed something else. A brand new flagpole in their front yard, taller than any in the neighborhood, with the American flag flying proudly at the top and the Marine Corps flag just below it. "The new HOA approved it unanimously," Margaret explained. "It's their gift to you." Mike shook his head in amazement. "And to think you were worried about moving here." Inside, Mike went straight to his room, where the new dress blues hung in a special display case on the wall. He stood before it silently for a long moment. "They're perfect," he said finally. "But what happened to the ones who burned my uniform? That Keller woman?" Jack and Margaret exchanged glances. "She's gone," Jack said simply, "moved away. But the important thing is what happened after. This neighborhood found its heart's son." At 4:00, they walked to the community park. Mike in his service uniform, Jack and Margaret on either side. As they crested the hill, Mike stopped in his tracks. The entire community had gathered. A banner reading, "Whispering Pines honors our heroes," stretched across the pavilion. Tables laden with food lined one side of the park, while children played games on the other. At the center stood a small stage with a podium. Colonel Reeves was there, along with several of the officers who had stood with the Sullivans months before. The Patriot Guard riders had returned, forming an honored guard at the park entrance. As Mike approached, they snapped to attention. Ted Wilson stepped forward. "Lance Corporal Sullivan, on behalf of Whispering Pines, welcome home." The crowd erupted in applause. Mike, visibly moved, shook Ted's hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Ted replied, "but there are some people here who'd like to speak to you." One by one, veterans from the community came forward to welcome Mike home and share brief words of encouragement. Children presented him with hand-drawn cards and letters.